How to write good survey research questions is a skill that can be learned over time. You don't have to be perfect. So this video is meant for those that are interested in understanding what are those tips, what are those things you need to keep in mind when you're building out your survey, or another way of thinking about it, when you're building out your questionnaire for your research. This is important because you need to make sure you're collecting accurate data and not missing anything. And then you also want to make sure you're writing your questions in a way that reduces bias. All of those are for the means of gathering the best data that you can to inform your business decisions. It's not great to spend time, money, and effort to build a survey and then not trust the data that comes back. Why this is important to me is I'm a market researcher with 10 plus years in the marketing research industry. I've worked for 3 Fortune 500 companies, and currently I work in tech. And so from different industries that I've worked in, I've been able to aggregate the best practices for this video today. I have 12 tips today to help refine and build out your questionnaire. Tip number 1, when you're writing your questions, remember that the order that you put them in will bias the following question. Meaning, make sure you start out broad or make sure you're starting out with your key question, because the data that you are inserting into your question or insert your stimuli will be top of mind for your respondent. Remember, the information that you're putting into your questions or your stimuli will influence the following questions. And this is important because you want to make sure each question is being evaluated independently. So a good example of this is if you're trying to build a brand and you want to understand your current awareness of your company, you first want to ask awareness and then ask their preference. A bad example of this is if you were to list out a list of brands and then ask for each one, what is your preference or what are your opinions on that? At that point, they're already aware of the brands. You can't also then go ask what brands they're aware of, either unaided, meaning asking it more open-ended, or aided, giving a list, because you've just reminded them, if you ask preference first, of all the brands in the category. So that is an example where you want to make sure that you do not flip those orders of those questions. The next one is you want to make sure your questions are clear and concise. Don't use too much industry or technical jargon. You want to avoid this best as possible. No, there are some industries that have specific language. However, don't assume that your audience knows this. Even if I'm doing research with adults, I word my questions as close to an 8th grade reading level. Even with those more niche audiences, think of like a doctor or a developer or something where there's a lot of, I would say, technical jargon. Don't assume everybody knows all the language. A good example of this is asking, how many days a week do you use public transportation? A bad way of asking this is, what is the frequency of your utilization of a mass transit system? Which one is more clear? If you're running a quantitative survey, you want to use more closed-ended questions, meaning you have a list of responses that an individual will select or select multiple. Open-ended questions do have a place in research, absolutely, especially with qualitative research, and you can fit 1 to 2 open-ended questions in a quantitative survey. However, they are really hard to analyze, especially if you're trying to get, I would say, more scale to your responses. It's really hard to code, it takes time, and then also you don't have statistics to be able to map your data to. A good example of a closed-ended question would be, how satisfied are you with your service? And then you would have a 5-point scale of very dissatisfied to very satisfied. Bad example of a closed-ended question is really an open-ended question, which would be, how satisfied are you with your service? This could be great for open-ended or more qualitative questions if you really want to probe in and understand their experience. However, for a survey, it's just not best. Next, avoid leading questions. Avoid inserting your opinion or potentially the opinion that you're expecting to receive into the question itself. A good example of this would be, how would you rate your recent experience using our service? And then you would have a scale that went from very negative to very positive. A bad example of this would be, what was your experience with our top leading product? When you put in a claim or some sort of like extra element into that question, you're not really testing their opinion as clearly as you could if you removed that bias. Next, utilize skip logic. This is an element that you can code into your survey where you can direct respondents a different way depending on their previous answer. So for example, a good example of this would be if a respondent had selected that yes, they purchased your product, and then the follow-up question would be, what is your favorite product? And then you could show different ones. A bad example of this would be if you didn't ask if they are a current purchaser of your product, and instead you just asked, which of these is your favorite product? The challenge with that is if there isn't an option that has, I don't use your product, I don't have a favorite product, I don't like your product, individuals will just kind of code and may guess, and then also just get really frustrated because they feel that you aren't able to really hear and understand their opinion. Next, keep it short. You want to minimize the amount of time it takes for somebody to go through your survey. And this means you need to shorten your questions to be as clear as possible. For example, ask somebody what is their experience with your product. Ask somebody how satisfied they are. You can get into different product attributes of how is the quality, how is the price. But those are individual questions, and you need to balance your survey length with really prioritizing what questions you want to ask. What you don't want to do, a bad example of this would be if you were to ask a question such as, how was your experience leveraging our product when you were there last time, in the past 1 to 2 weeks, and how was the quality, the price? See, it just keeps going on and on. It's hard for the respondent to really figure out what you're trying to understand, but then also it's just going to take more mental capacity and they're less likely to finish your survey. See, that was a bad example where it ran on. It's hard for an individual to know what they're supposed to rate it on. Also, they're less likely to finish your survey, and your completion rate is going to go down because you are making your survey more difficult for an individual to answer. Next, ensure clarity and really just adding definitions when needed. So for example, like I mentioned earlier, don't assume everybody knows every term. So when in doubt, enter a definition or add a note at the bottom of your question or add an ability to kind of hover over a word and get a definition. Something that makes it clear what something is. For example, you can just simply ask, how often do you shop online? And a bad example of this would be, what is your frequency of leveraging e-commerce service? Don't assume that everybody knows what e-commerce means. So try to use simple terms that are more universally leveraged by the general population. Next, be aware that it's going to be really hard for somebody to predict their future. You can understand future intent. You can gauge, for example, what is your likelihood to purchase this. However, when you're trying to have somebody give you their, I would say, journey of where they're going to go, it's really hard to capture that with data. So the best way of doing this is ask questions about their past, ask questions about their behavior, and then understand their future intent compared to that behavior. A good example of this would be ask them which products they purchase, and then ask them, what is your likelihood to purchase in the future? A bad example of this is asking, how many times this year are you expecting to purchase our product? The challenge is you need to ground that in what they're doing currently. So don't just ask future, make sure you're grounding it on their past behavior. Next, tied with that, make sure you're having clarity on the time that you're referencing. So for example, it's really hard for somebody to kind of recall a year or 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, or, look so far in advance. When in doubt, and I would just say best practice, try to shorten the time you are trying to capture, and then use math to kind of estimate what it would be for a year. So for example, a good way to understand this would be, how many times did you drive your car in the past week? And then people can give you an estimate, or even like, how many times have you driven your car in the past 3 days or something like that. A bad example would be, how many times have you driven your car in the past year? See which one is easier for you personally to be able to estimate. Next, when you're leveraging terms that we often use in business, for example, like regular or often, and oftentimes we want to put this in our survey because it's more natural language. The challenge is everybody's definition of those terms is different. So instead, try to choose what is that variable that is more finite that you can have the individual respond to. A good example of this is how often do you visit our store in a given week? A bad example of this would be how often do you visit our store? And then instead of asking for a particular number of days or number of times in a week, you ask not very regularly to very regularly, or it's something like sometimes, often, regular. Those mean different things to different people. So unless you're trying to understand like someone's perception of it, it's going to be really hard for you to do anything with the data. Next, avoid double-barreled or double negative questions. Really, just make it simple. Don't try to fit too many things in a question. Don't ask two different metrics in a question. Ask one thing per question, as simple as possible. For example, if you wanted to know their perception of your product, and then you also wanted to know, let's say, how many times they expect to use it, ask those in two separate questions. A bad way would be trying to say, what is your perception of this? And then how often do you plan to use our products in the future? Don't put them in the same thing. A bad example of a double negative would be something like, can you share your last poor experience that was not good? Finally, provide comprehensive answer options. So one, make sure there is an other or a none of the above or some other option that a respondent can select if they don't like anything that you've shown, or that maybe there is another option that they're thinking of. You want to make sure that you have that there so you can capture data accurately and then also just miss anything that you didn't think of. And then you also want to make sure you're inserting any directions that you are asking. So for example, if there's a slider, you want to make sure to include directions on like how to slide the scale, or if it's a multi-select, make sure to have select all. These are little tips that I have found through my experience in writing surveys that have really helped me collect accurate data and be able to inform business decisions. Please like and subscribe. It helps me understand if this information is valuable and helps me build out my channel. Also, please put a comment in if you have any advice or if you have any questions on any of the topics that we talked through today. Thank you so much. I'll talk to you later. Bye.